The blood on her dress was still damp when Teresa Donnelly stumbled into the ramshackle trading post on the outskirts of Helena, Montana, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the doorframe. She had been traveling with her father's wagon train for 3 months when the Blackfeet raiding party descended upon them like a summer storm, swift and merciless, leaving behind only smoke and silence and the kind of emptiness that carved holes in a person's chest. She was 22 years old, alone in a territory that swallowed people whole, and the only reason she still drew breath was because she had hidden beneath her father's overturned wagon for 6 hours straight, not moving even when the flies began to gather. The year was 1874, and Montana Territory was still wild enough to kill a person for making one wrong decision. Teresa had made several. First, she had insisted on coming west with her father despite his protests. Second, she had worn a dress that was far too fine for this country, pale blue calico that now bore rust-colored stains she tried not to think about. Third, she had walked into this trading post without knowing that 4 buffalo hunters had been drinking rot-gut whiskey since dawn, and men with that much alcohol in their blood and that much isolation in their bones rarely remembered their manners. The trading post smelled like cured hides and tobacco and something feral that Teresa could not quite identify. Behind the rough wooden counter stood a man with a long gray beard and suspicious eyes, watching her like she might steal something. The buffalo hunters occupied a corner table, their rifles propped against the wall, their clothes so stained with blood and dirt that they seemed to have grown from the earth itself. Teresa approached the counter, trying to steady her voice. "I need supplies. Food, blanket, maybe a horse if you have one to spare. My father's wagon train was attacked 2 days north of here. I am the only survivor." The bearded man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You got money?" "Some." She reached into the pocket sewn into her skirt, pulling out the small leather pouch her father had given her before they left St. Louis. It contained perhaps $30 in coins and paper money, enough to get her through a few weeks if she was careful. One of the buffalo hunters stood up, swaying slightly. He was a thick man with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and then left out in the weather too long. "Well now, what do we have here? A proper lady, come to visit us common folk." Teresa ignored him, keeping her attention on the shopkeeper. "I will pay fair prices." Another hunter laughed, the sound like gravel scraping across wood. "She will pay fair prices, she says. You hear that, boys? A lady with manners." He stood as well, moving closer. "What happened to your dress, darling? Looks like you've been rolling around in something unpleasant." "Leave me alone." Teresa's voice was steadier than she felt. The third hunter, younger than the others but with the same predatory gleam in his eyes, whistled low. "She has got some spirit. I like that in a woman. Tell us, sweetheart, you looking for some protection? These woods are dangerous for a lady traveling alone. We could take real good care of you." The fourth hunter slammed his hand on the table, laughing. "Real good care. We have not seen a woman in 6 months. We would be very attentive hosts." Teresa felt her face burning, but she refused to look at them. The shopkeeper was watching the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and resignation, clearly unwilling to intervene. She realized with a cold certainty that she was entirely alone here, and these men knew it. "I am just passing through," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I do not want any trouble." The thick hunter moved closer, and now Teresa could smell the whiskey on his breath, sharp and sour. "No trouble at all. We are just being friendly. Cannot blame a man for appreciating a fine figure when he sees one, even if it is attached to a woman who looks like she crawled through a slaughterhouse." The others laughed, and the younger one added, "Maybe she likes it rough. That why your dress is all torn up, sweetheart? Someone already sampled the goods?" Teresa's hand tightened on her coin purse, her whole body rigid with fear and fury. She had survived an attack that killed everyone she loved, had walked for 2 days through wilderness that could kill her with cold or hunger or any number of predators, and now these men were treating her like she was something they could paw at and demean. The injustice of it burned in her throat like bile. "I said leave me alone." She turned to face them now, her dark eyes blazing. "My father just died. Everyone I knew just died. Show some basic human decency." The thick hunter's expression hardened. "You come in here looking like that. You cannot expect men not to notice. Maybe where you come from, women can talk back to men, but out here we have different rules. Out here, a woman alone is fair game, especially one who presents herself so carelessly." Teresa felt tears pricking at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give these men the satisfaction. "You are despicable." "We are practical," the younger hunter said, reaching out to touch her arm. The door of the trading post opened with enough force that it slammed against the wall, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The man who entered had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, and when he straightened to his full height, he seemed to fill the entire space with his presence. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they strained against his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was all hard angles and sharp edges, weathered by sun and wind until it looked like it had been carved from the mountains themselves. But it was his eyes that made Teresa's breath catch. They were a startling pale gray, like ice on a winter river, and they held an intelligence and intensity that seemed to see straight through to a person's core. He took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, his gaze moving from Teresa's terrified face to the hunters crowding around her, and something dangerous flickered across his expression. "Step away from her." His voice was low and rough, like distant thunder, and it carried the kind of authority that made men obey without thinking. The buffalo hunters hesitated, clearly recognizing the threat, but the thick one tried to bluster through. "This is not your concern, mountain man. We are just having a friendly conversation with the lady." The mountain man moved forward with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone his size, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He positioned himself between Teresa and the hunters, and suddenly she found herself staring at a wall of muscle and buckskin. "Did not sound friendly. Sounded like you were harassing a woman who clearly wants nothing to do with you." "Listen here," the thick hunter started, puffing up his chest. "We have been hunting buffalo in these parts for 2 years. We know all the mountain men, and we do not know you. You do not get to come in here and tell us what to do." The mountain man tilted his head slightly, studying the hunter with an expression of mild curiosity. "Name is Yates Dalton. I've been trapping these mountains for 8 years. I know every creek, every pass, every place where a body could disappear and never be found. Now I'm telling you again, step away from the lady." The younger hunter, emboldened by whiskey and stupidity, sneered. "Or what? There are 4 of us and 1 of you. Those are not good odds, even for a big man." Yates did not move, but something in his stillness was more threatening than any aggressive gesture could have been. 4 drunk buffalo hunters with soft hands and slower reflexes. I have faced down grizzly bears that scared me more than you do." Teresa watched the exchange with her heart hammering in her chest. She knew she should be terrified violence was clearly about to erupt, but instead she felt a strange sense of relief. This man, this stranger, was willing to stand between her and danger without even knowing her name. After 2 days of running and hiding and feeling utterly powerless, the simple fact of his presence was like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. The thick hunter made a move toward his rifle, and Yates moved so fast that Teresa barely tracked it. One moment he was standing still, the next his hand had shot out and caught the hunter by the throat, lifting him onto his toes. The other 3 hunters reached for their weapons, but Yates's other hand went to the massive knife sheathed at his belt, drawing it in a smooth motion that suggested he had done this particular dance many times before. "I would reconsider," Yates said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel beneath the words. "Your friend here would be dead before you cleared leather, and then we would see how brave you feel." The shopkeeper finally found his voice. "No killing in my establishment. I do not want any trouble here." Yates glanced at the shopkeeper without releasing his grip on the hunter's throat. "Then perhaps you should have spoken up when these men were harassing this lady. Since you did not, I am handling it." The thick hunter was making choking sounds, his face turning red, and his companions had frozen with their hands on their weapons, but clearly uncertain how to proceed. Teresa found herself mesmerized by the raw power in Yates's arm. He was holding a 200-pound man off the ground with one hand, as if he weighed nothing at all. "Now," Yates continued, addressing all 4 hunters, Here is what is going to happen. You are going to apologize to this lady for your crude behavior and your offensive comments. You are going to do it on your knees so she knows you mean it, and then you are going to leave this trading post and not come back while she is here. Understood?" The thick hunter tried to speak but could only manage a wheeze. Yates loosened his grip slightly, enough for the man to gasp out, "You cannot be serious." "Completely serious." Yates's pale eyes were absolutely cold. "I have spent 8 years in these mountains with minimal human company, which means I have very little patience for men who think they can terrorize women. The way I see it, you have 2 choices. You can apologize properly and walk out of here, or I can drag you outside and teach you about respect the hard way. Your choice, but you have got about 10 seconds to decide." Teresa found her voice, surprising herself. "You do not have to do this. I can just leave." Yates glanced over his shoulder at her, and for a brief moment his expression softened. "You should not have to leave, miss. You came here for supplies, and you have every right to conduct your business without being molested by fools." He returned his attention to the hunters. 5 seconds. The younger hunter was the first to crack, seeing something in Yates's face that convinced him this was not a bluff. Fine, we will apologize." He lowered himself to his knees, his expression sullen. "Sorry, miss." Yates shook his head. "Not good enough. A proper apology. Tell her exactly what you are sorry for." The younger hunter's jaw clenched, but he complied. "I'm sorry for making inappropriate comments about your appearance and your circumstances. It was wrong and disrespectful." Yates nodded, then looked at the other 2 hunters who were still standing. "Your turn." They exchanged glances, then slowly knelt, their pride clearly wounded, but their sense of self-preservation stronger. One by one, they apologized, their words grudging but audible. Finally, Yates released the thick hunter, who collapsed to his knees, coughing and gasping for air. "Your turn," Yates said, his voice implacable. The thick hunter glared up at him with pure hatred, but he could see there was no way out of this situation that did not end with him hurt or dead. "I apologize for my crude jokes and comments," he ground out. "I was out of line." Teresa stood frozen, watching 4 grown men kneel before her and apologize, and something fierce and vindicated swelled in her chest. She knew she should probably feel uncomfortable with the violence implicit in this scene, but mostly what she felt was a savage satisfaction that these men were finally experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness they had tried to make her feel. "Now get out," Yates said. "Leave your rifles. You can collect them tomorrow when you have sobered up and remembered your manners." The thick hunter looked like he wanted to argue, but one glance at Yates's face convinced him otherwise. The 4 men climbed to their feet and filed out of the trading post like chastised children, shooting venomous looks over their shoulders, but smart enough not to say anything further. The door closed behind them, and the silence that followed felt almost physical. Yates turned to Teresa, and his entire demeanor changed. The cold fury was gone, replaced by something careful and gentle. "Are you hurt, miss?" Teresa shook her head, then realized she was trembling. No, I'm fine, thank you. I do not know what would have happened if you had not arrived when you did." "Nothing good." Yates studied her blood-stained dress, the exhaustion in her face, the desperate grip she still had on her coin purse. "The shopkeeper said you survived an attack. You need more than supplies. You need a safe place to rest and recover." Teresa felt her throat tighten. "I do not have anywhere to go. The wagon train was heading to Virginia City, but I do not know anyone there. I do not know anyone anywhere in this territory." Yates was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking. Then he turned to the shopkeeper. "Ben, I am taking this lady up to my cabin. She needs food, rest, and safety. If those buffalo hunters come back causing trouble, you send word." Ben nodded quickly, clearly relieved that the confrontation had ended without bloodshed in his establishment. "Sure thing, Yates. Miss, you will be safe with him. Yates Dalton is a hard man, but he is an honorable one." Teresa looked between the 2 men, her mind racing. Every instinct she had been raised with told her not to go off alone with a strange man, especially not to his isolated cabin in the wilderness. But those same instincts had also told her that the world was basically safe and ordered, and look where that had gotten her. Her father was dead. Everyone she knew was dead. The rules she had lived by clearly did not apply out here, and there was something about Yates that made her feel safe despite all logic. Maybe it was the way he had positioned himself between her and danger without hesitation. Maybe it was the way he had demanded respect on her behalf when no one else would. Or maybe it was simply that she was so tired, so scared, so utterly exhausted from holding herself together for 2 days straight that she needed to trust someone or she would shatter completely. "I do not want to be a burden," she said quietly. Yates's expression softened further. "You would not be. I have more than enough food for 2, and my cabin has a spare room. You can stay as long as you need to figure out your next move." He paused. "I give you my word that you will be safe and respected under my roof." Teresa met his pale gray eyes and saw nothing but sincerity there. She nodded. "Then I accept. Thank you, Mr. Dalton." "Just Yates." He turned to Ben. "Load up some basic supplies for the lady. Fresh clothes if you have them, soap, food staples. I will pay." "That is not necessary," Teresa protested. "I have money." Yates shook his head. "Save your money. You might need it later." He pulled out several bills and laid them on the counter, ignoring her protests. 30 minutes later, Teresa found herself mounted on Yates's enormous bay gelding while he walked alongside, carrying both his pack and the supplies Ben had assembled. The horse was as massive as its owner, with a calm temperament that suggested it was accustomed to Yates's protective handling. As they left Helena behind and headed into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, Teresa felt the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease slightly. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine trees, and the air was sharp with the scent of sap and earth. "How far is your cabin?" she asked. "About 2 hours on foot. Faster if I was alone, but I am setting a gentle pace." Yates glanced up at her. "You need to tell me if you need to rest. You look like you have been through hell." Teresa let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That's an accurate description." She paused. "My name is Teresa Donnelly. I realized I never properly introduced myself." "Teresa." He said her name carefully, as if tasting it. "Pretty name." They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the thud of the horse's hooves on the forest floor and the distant call of birds. Teresa found herself studying Yates as he navigated the terrain with easy confidence. Everything about him suggested competence and strength, the way he moved through the forest, as if he were part of it. The casual way he carried weight that would have been another man double. The constant alertness in his eyes as he scanned their surroundings for threats. His buckskin shirt was open at the throat, revealing tan skin and the strong column of his neck, and his forearms were corded with muscle built from years of hard work. He was beautiful in a raw, elemental way that had nothing to do with conventional refinement and everything to do with pure masculine power. "Why did you help me?" Teresa asked suddenly. "You did not know me. You could have walked away." Yates was quiet for several strides before answering. "My mother was alone when my father died. Some men helped her, some men tried to take advantage of her vulnerability. The ones who helped her made it possible for us to survive. I decided a long time ago that I would be the kind of man who helps, not the kind who takes advantage." He glanced up at her again. "And those buffalo hunters needed to be taught a lesson. Men like that, they only respect force. If I had just asked them nicely to stop, they would have laughed and continued. Sometimes you have to make people understand there are consequences for their actions." "You could have been hurt, 4 against 1. Yates's mouth quirked in something that might have been amusement. "I have faced worse odds, and I was not particularly worried about drunk buffalo hunters. They are tough enough when they are shooting animals from a distance. But most of them have never been in a real fight. You have been in real fights." It was not a question, and Yates did not treat it like one. "More than I care to remember. This country is beautiful, but it is also brutal. You learn to fight or you die." Teresa thought about the Blackfeet warriors who had attacked her wagon train, the speed and efficiency with which they had killed trained outriders and armed men. "I'm starting to understand that." Yates heard something in her voice and stopped walking, turning to look up at her with concern in his gray eyes. "Do you want to talk about what happened? Sometimes it helps." Teresa shook her head quickly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. Right now I just want to think about something else, anything else." "Fair enough," he resumed walking. "Then I will tell you about my cabin. It is nothing fancy, but it is solid and warm. I built it myself 5 years ago. using lodgepole pine from the surrounding forest. 2 rooms main living area with a fireplace and kitchen space, and a smaller sleeping room that I use for storage mostly. You can have that room. I will sleep in the main area. I do not want to displace you from your own bed. You are not. I sleep where I need to sleep. Comfort is not a priority for me. He gestured ahead to where the trail began to climb more steeply. The cabin is in a small valley between 2 ridges. Good water from a spring, decent hunting, far enough from town that I do not get many visitors. I prefer it that way. You do not like people? Yates considered the question. I like people fine, in small doses, but I have spent so much time alone now that I find most social interaction exhausting. I go into town maybe once a month for supplies and news, and that is about all the civilization I can tolerate. What made you become a mountain man? Teresa asked, genuinely curious. Same thing that makes most men choose this life. I wanted freedom. I wanted to live by my own rules instead of society's rules. I wanted to test myself against something real, not the artificial challenges of civilized life. He paused, and I suppose I wanted to prove I could survive without anyone's help. Stupid young man pride. You do not seem that old now. I'm 31. Been out here since I was 23. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, sometimes it feels like yesterday. Teresa did the mental arithmetic. He was 9 years older than her, which felt appropriate somehow. He had the kind of weathered confidence that came from experience, while she felt like a child playing at being an adult. Everything she had thought she knew about herself and the world had been stripped away in the span of a few hours, and she was still trying to figure out who she was in the aftermath. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western mountains when they finally crested a ridge, and Teresa saw Yates's cabin below them. It was exactly as he had described, a sturdy log structure in a small valley, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. A small corral stood nearby, empty at the moment, and she could see the glint of water from a creek running along the eastern edge of the clearing. Smoke would have been rising from the chimney if Yates had been home, but the place looked peaceful and still, like a painting of frontier life. It is beautiful, Teresa said softly. Yates looked at his home with an expression of quiet pride. It serves its purpose. Come on, let us get you settled before full dark. He helped her dismount, and Teresa was embarrassed to find that her legs barely supported her weight. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay suddenly crashed over her like a wave, and she swayed dangerously. Yates caught her with one arm around her waist, steadying her with effortless strength. Easy there. You have been running on pure determination for too long. Your body is trying to tell you it needs rest. He kept his arm around her as he guided her toward the cabin. We will get some food in you, get you cleaned up, and then you're going to sleep for about 12 hours. Teresa did not have the energy to argue. She let Yates lead her inside the cabin, which was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's dwelling. The main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace with a rough wooden table and 2 chairs near the kitchen area. Shelves lined one wall, holding supplies and equipment, and Teresa could see animal pelts stacked neatly in one corner. A bearskin rug covered part of the floor, and the whole place smelled like wood smoke and pine. Yates settled her into one of the chairs and immediately began building a fire, his movements practiced and efficient. Within minutes, flames were crackling cheerfully, pushing back the evening chill. He filled a pot with water from a barrel near the door and hung it over the fire to heat, then rummaged through his supplies. I've got salt pork, beans, some dried vegetables, cornbread from a few days ago that is still edible, he said. Nothing fancy, but it is filling. Anything sounds wonderful right now, Teresa admitted. I've not eaten since yesterday morning. Yates's expression darkened. You walked for 2 days without proper food or rest? Teresa, you could have died. I almost did. Several times. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the growing warmth from the fire. I did not know what else to do. I just knew I had to keep moving or I would fall apart. Yates set a pot of beans onto heat and came to kneel in front of her chair, bringing his face level with hers. His pale gray eyes were intense but kind. You are safe now. I know that's hard to believe after what you have been through, but I promise you, while you are under my protection, nothing is going to hurt you. Do you understand? Teresa felt tears welling up despite her best efforts to control them. There was something about the absolute certainty in his voice, the unwavering conviction that broke through the walls she'd been maintaining. "I watched them die," she whispered. "My father, the other families, everyone. I hid like a coward while they were killed." "You survived," Yates said firmly. "That does not make you a coward, that makes you smart. If you had tried to fight, you would be dead too, and then who would remember them? Who would carry their story forward?" "I should have done something." "There was nothing you could do. Sometimes survival is the only victory available." He reached out and gently took one of her hands, his grip warm and solid. "I have seen men die in this wilderness, good men who did everything right but still ended up dead because this land is unforgiving. The fact that you made it to town alone, that you kept your wits about you enough to seek help that takes strength most people do not have." Teresa looked down at their joined hands. His were huge, calloused from years of hard work, scarred in places where weapons or tools or animal claws had marked him. They were hands that could snap a man's neck without effort, but they held hers with such careful gentleness that she felt something crack open inside her chest. The tears came then, hot and fast, and she could not stop them. She had not cried when she watched her father fall with an arrow in his chest. She had not cried when she crawled through the blood-soaked grass to hide beneath the wagon. She had not cried during the long, terrifying hours of walking through unfamiliar wilderness, but now, in the warmth of this cabin with this stranger's hand holding hers, she finally broke. Yates did not tell her to stop crying or try to hush her. He simply moved from kneeling to sitting on the floor beside her chair, keeping hold of her hand, and let her weep. When she began to shake with the force of her sobs, he pulled her down from the chair and into his lap, wrapping his massive arms around her and holding her like she was something precious that might shatter. Teresa buried her face against his chest and cried until she had no more tears left, until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen and all the terror and grief of the past 2 days had poured out of her. When she finally quieted, hiccuping softly against his buckskin shirt, Yates gently stroked her hair. "Better?" "I got your shirt all wet," Teresa mumbled, embarrassed. "It will dry. Are you feeling better?" Teresa considered the question. She felt wrung out and exhausted, but also somehow lighter, as if crying had released some of the pressure that had been building in her chest. "A little. Thank you for not telling me to be strong." "Grief is strength," Yates said quietly. "It means you loved people enough that losing them tears you apart. There's nothing weak about that." They sat like that for a while longer, Teresa curled in Yates's lap like a child, while the fire crackled and the beans bubbled in their pot. She was distantly aware that this was highly improper, an unmarried woman sitting in an unmarried man's lap, in his isolated cabin with no chaperone, but propriety seemed like a concern from another lifetime. Out here, the only rules that mattered were survival and trust, and she trusted this mountain man more than she had trusted anyone in a very long time. Eventually, Yates stirred, carefully lifting her and setting her back in the chair. "I need to check on the food before it burns. Think you can stay upright?" Teresa nodded, wiping at her eyes. "I'm sorry for falling apart like that." "Do not apologize for being human." He moved to the fire and stirred the beans, then sliced some of the salt pork and added it to the pot. The smell made Teresa's stomach growl audibly, and Yates glanced over with a slight smile. "I will take that as a sign you have an appetite." While the food finished cooking, Yates poured some of the heated water into a basin and brought it over with a clean cloth. "You might want to wash up before you eat. There's a screen in the corner you can change behind. Ben packed you a few basic garments." Teresa looked down at her blood-stained dress and felt a wave of revulsion. She wanted it off her body, wanted to burn it, wanted to never see it again. "Thank you." She took the basin and the bundle of clothes behind the wooden screen Yates had indicated, stripping out of the ruined dress with shaking hands. She washed as best she could with the warm water and cloth, scrubbing away days of dirt and sweat and blood until her skin was pink and raw. The clothes Ben had packed were simple, a plain cotton shift, a wool skirt, a serviceable blouse, but they were clean and they fit reasonably well. When she emerged from behind the screen, feeling more human than she had in days, Yates had 2 bowls of beans and salt pork waiting on the table. They ate in comfortable silence, Teresa devouring her portion with an enthusiasm that would have horrified her mother if she could have seen it. Yates ate steadily, occasionally glancing at her to make sure she was managing. When they had finished, he collected the bowls and cleaned them with quick efficiency. "The sleeping room is through that door," he said, gesturing. "I put some blankets on the cot earlier, and there should be enough room for you to store your things. I will be out here if you need anything during the night." Teresa stood, her legs feeling steadier now that she had eaten. "Yates, I do not know how to thank you. You have done so much for me already, and I have nothing to offer in return." "I do not want anything in return." He met her eyes. "Just rest and recover. Everything else can wait." Teresa wanted to say something more, to express the depth of her gratitude, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she simply nodded and headed toward the sleeping room. The cot was narrow but comfortable, piled with wool blankets and a pillow stuffed with what felt like feathers. She crawled under the covers fully dressed, too tired to care about nightclothes, and was asleep before she had time to think about where she was or what came next. The next few days established a rhythm. Teresa would wake late in the morning to find Yates already up, having completed half a day's worth of work. He would have breakfast ready, simple fare like cornmeal mush or Johnny cakes, and they would eat together while he outlined his plans for the day. He was working on preparing his winter stores, smoking meat and tanning hides, and Teresa quickly realized that mountain life involved constant, back-breaking work. Nothing came easy out here. Everything required effort and skill and careful planning. She insisted on helping despite his protests, and Yates eventually relented when he saw she was determined. He taught her how to properly smoke venison so it would keep through the winter, how to scrape a hide clean without damaging it, how to identify edible plants in the surrounding forest. Teresa threw herself into the work with something approaching desperation, grateful to have tasks that occupied her hands and mind and kept her from dwelling too much on what she had lost. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. Yates was not naturally talkative, but he seemed to understand that Teresa needed conversation, needed to feel connected to another human being. He told her about his childhood in Ohio, about his mother who had died when he was 16, about the restlessness that had driven him west in search of something he could not quite name. Teresa talked about her life in St. Louis, about her father's dream of starting a new life in Montana, about the small details of her past that suddenly seemed precious now that everything familiar was gone. What surprised Teresa most was how safe she felt with Yates. He was scrupulously respectful of her space and privacy, never pressing her for more than she was willing to share, never making her feel uncomfortable or threatened. But there was also a growing awareness between them, a tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with attraction. She found herself watching the way his muscles flexed when he lifted heavy loads, the way his hair fell forward when he leaned over his work, the rare smile that softened his hard features when she said something that amused him. And she caught him watching her too, his pale gray eyes following her movements with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. It had been 2 weeks since Teresa arrived at the cabin when Yates asked her the question she had been dreading. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, and he had been unusually quiet all evening. "You need to start thinking about what comes next," he said gently. "You are welcome to stay here as long as you want, but winter is coming in a few months, and you need to have a plan. Do you have family back east? Friends in Virginia City? Anyone who could help you get settled?" Teresa stared into the fire, her stomach knotting. She had been avoiding this exact question because she did not have a good answer. "No family. My mother died when I was young, and my father was an only child. I have some distant cousins in Pennsylvania, but I barely know them." She paused. "And I do not want to go to Virginia City. Everyone there would have been expecting to see my father and the others. I cannot face that." "You could stay in Helena," Yates suggested. "Find work, maybe as a seamstress or a cook. You are smart and capable. You would manage." "I could," Teresa agreed slowly. But the thought of living in town, being surrounded by people, having to explain over and over what happened. She trailed off, unable to articulate the dread that filled her at the idea. Yates was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, his voice carefully neutral, "There is another option. You could stay here." Teresa's heart jumped. "Here? In your cabin?" "I know how it sounds," Yates said quickly, "and I know it is not proper. But proper does not mean much out here, and I—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. "I've gotten used to having you here. The cabin does not feel as empty, and I think you are happier here than you would be in town." Am I wrong? Teresa realized her hands were shaking. No, you're not wrong. I love it here. The peace, the work, the mountains. I feel like I can breathe for the first time in my life. She met his eyes. But people would talk. They would say terrible things about both of us. Let them talk. I have never cared much what people think, and I doubt you do either at this point. Yates leaned forward, his expression earnest. I'm not asking anything improper of you, Teresa. You would have your room. I would have mine. We would live as friends working together to survive. That's all. Just friends? Teresa heard herself ask and was shocked by her own boldness. Yates went very still, his eyes searching her face. What are you saying? Teresa took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She had spent 2 weeks watching this man, learning his habits and his character, seeing the kindness beneath his rough exterior. She knew she was developing feelings for him that went far beyond gratitude or friendship, and she was almost certain he felt the same way. The question was whether she had the courage to acknowledge it out loud. I am saying that living as friends sounds lonely, she said quietly, and I'm saying that if people are going to gossip anyway, we might as well give them something worth gossiping about. Yates drew in a sharp breath. Teresa, you have been through trauma. You are not thinking clearly. You might feel grateful to me now, but that is not the same as... I know the difference between gratitude and attraction, Teresa interrupted. I have had time to think about this. Believe me, I have had nothing but time to think about this, and I know what I want. What do you want? His voice was rough, almost desperate. Teresa stood up, her legs feeling shaky but her resolve firm. She crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of Yates's chair, placing her hands on his knees. I want to stay here. I want to build a life in this place, and I want to do it with you, not just near you. She paused. I'm 22 years old, Yates. I'm not a child. I know my own mind, and my mind is telling me that what I feel for you is real and worth pursuing. Yates looked down at her, his expression torn between longing and caution. If this is going to happen, we do it properly. I will not have people calling you names or treating you like something less than you are. We would need to get married. Then let us get married. Teresa felt a strange exhilaration at saying the words out loud. I know it sounds crazy. We have only known each other for 2 weeks, but I have learned that life is short and uncertain, and when you find something good, you should hold on to it. Are you sure? Yates reached out and cupped her face with one huge hand, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. Because once we do this, there is no going back. I am not a sophisticated man, Teresa. I cannot offer you fancy things or an easy life. What I can offer is hard work and simple living and my absolute devotion. That is all I have. Teresa turned her head to press a kiss against his palm. That is everything I want. Yates made a sound that was half laugh, half groan, and then he was pulling her up into his lap and kissing her with a passion that stole her breath. His lips were warm and firm against hers, moving with a confidence that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing, despite his years of isolation. Teresa kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands sliding into his long hair, pulling him closer. She had been kissed before, chased stolen moments with a boy back in St. Louis, but this was nothing like those fumbling encounters. This was heat and hunger and a promise of something wild. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. We go into Helena tomorrow. We find a preacher, we get married, we do this right. Agreed? Agreed, Teresa smiled, feeling giddy and reckless and more alive than she had felt since before the attack. Although I should warn you, I do not have a proper wedding dress. You could marry me in a flour sack, and I would still think you were the most beautiful thing I have ever seen, Yates said with such sincerity that Teresa felt tears prick her eyes again, though these were happy tears rather than grief. They spent the rest of the evening making plans, talking about how they would arrange their lives, what modifications they might need to make to the cabin, how they would handle the inevitable gossip when word got out. Yates was practical about the challenges they would face. Winters were harsh in these mountains, supplies could run short, isolation could be difficult. But Teresa found she did not care about any of it. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine, and she had come out the other side to find this unexpected gift. She was not going to let fear or propriety or other people's opinions keep her from embracing it. That night, they slept in separate rooms as they had been doing, but Teresa lay awake for hours thinking about the future. She thought about her father and what he would have said about her marrying a mountain man she barely knew. Part of her thought he would have been horrified. But another part, the part that had known her father best, thought he would have approved. He had always valued strength and integrity over social status, and Yates had both in abundance. The next morning they rose early and made the journey back to Helena. Teresa rode while Yates walked, just as they had on the trip to the cabin, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. There was an excitement in the air, a sense of anticipation that made even the familiar trail seem new and full of possibility. When they reached town, Yates led her directly to the small church at the edge of the settlement. The preacher was a thin man with a kind face who looked surprised but pleased when Yates explained what they wanted. He agreed to perform the ceremony immediately, though he did caution them about the seriousness of marriage and the importance of understanding what they were committing to. "We understand," Teresa said firmly. "We want to do this." The preacher nodded and fetched his wife to serve as a witness. The ceremony was simple and brief, nothing like the elaborate wedding Teresa had sometimes imagined as a girl, but it felt more real and meaningful than any fancy affair could have been. When Yates slipped a ring onto her finger, a simple gold band he had purchased from the general store. Just minutes earlier, Teresa felt a sense of rightness settle over her. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher said. "You may kiss your bride." Yates pulled Teresa close and kissed her gently, mindful of their audience, and Teresa felt joy bubble up inside her. She was married, she had a husband, she had a home and a future, and someone who had chosen her just as surely as she had chosen him. After the ceremony, they stopped by the trading post to let Ben know what had happened. The old shopkeeper looked shocked, but not displeased. "Well now, that is news. Congratulations to you both. I always did think Yates needed someone to share that cabin with. Gets too quiet up there in the mountains." They purchased a few celebratory supplies, some coffee that was not stale, a small sack of sugar, a bottle of whiskey that Yates said was for toasting their marriage, and then they headed back up into the hills. Teresa noticed that Yates seemed more relaxed now, as if some tension he had been carrying had finally released. He held her hand as they walked, his thumb rubbing small circles on her skin, and the gesture was so casually affectionate that it made Teresa's heart swell. When they reached the cabin, Yates surprised her by scooping her up in his arms and carrying her across the threshold. "Tradition," he explained with a rare grin. "Even mountain men observe some traditions." Teresa laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck. "I am glad you are my mountain man. And I am glad you are my wife." He set her down gently and cupped her face in both hands. "Teresa Dalton, I like the sound of that." "So do I." Teresa reached up to kiss him again, and this time there was no audience to constrain them. The kiss deepened, becoming something urgent and needful, and Teresa felt heat pooling low in her belly. She had only the vaguest understanding of what happened between husbands and wives. Her father had been too embarrassed to explain, and her mother had died before she was old enough to ask. But her body seemed to understand instinctively what it wanted. Yates pulled back slightly, his breathing ragged. "We should slow down. I do not want to rush you." "I do not want to slow down." Teresa was surprised by her own boldness, but she meant every word. "We are married now, and I want my husband." Something fierce and possessive flashed across Yates's face. "You are sure? Completely sure?" What followed was both tender and passionate, Yates taking his time to make sure Teresa was comfortable and cared for, showing her with actions rather than words how much he valued her. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in his bed, their bed now, Teresa felt a bone-deep contentment that she had never experienced before. This was what it meant to be home, she realized, not a place, but a person. The months that followed were some of the happiest of Teresa's life. She and Yates settled into their marriage with surprising ease, learning each other's rhythms and habits, figuring out how to share space and work and life. Yates taught her to shoot a rifle and set snares, skills that Teresa absorbed with the same determination she applied to everything. She taught him to appreciate small comforts, convincing him to let her make curtains for the windows and plant an herb garden near the cabin. Winter came to the mountains in November, blanketing everything in snow and forcing them into closer quarters. Some couples might have struggled with the isolation, but Teresa and Yates thrived. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking and reading and simply being together. Yates had a small collection of books that he had acquired over the years, and Teresa worked her way through all of them, from Shakespeare to agricultural manuals. She also started writing, documenting their daily life and her thoughts about this new existence she had chosen. There were challenges, of course. Food ran low in February, and they had to carefully ration their supplies until Yates could hunt again. Teresa got sick with a fever that had Yates terrified for 3 days straight, convinced he was going to lose her to some unnamed wilderness illness. And there were moments when Teresa would remember her father and the others, when grief would strike her like a physical blow, and she would have to retreat to be alone with her tears. But through all of it, Yates was there, steady, strong, unshakable. He held her when she cried, celebrated with her when she mastered a new skill, made her laugh with his dry observations about the world. And Teresa realized that she had not just married him out of gratitude or convenience or even attraction. She loved him deeply and completely, with a fierceness that sometimes frightened her with its intensity. Spring arrived with a rush of meltwater and budding trees, and with it came visitors. A group of trappers passing through the area stopped at the cabin, word having spread that Yates Dalton had taken a wife. They were respectful but curious, clearly trying to figure out the story behind this unlikely marriage. Teresa handled their questions with grace, explaining that she had met Yates after her wagon train was attacked and had chosen to stay. One of the trappers, an older man with a gray beard, studied them both with shrewd eyes. "You two seem happy," he observed. "That is rare out here. Most marriages in the wilderness either burn hot and fast or freeze cold and slow. You have got something different." "We do," Yates agreed, his arm around Teresa's shoulders. "We have got something worth keeping." After the trappers left, Teresa asked Yates what the old man had meant about marriages burning or freezing. Yates explained that many mountain men took Native American wives, relationships that were sometimes based on genuine affection, but often on convenience and survival necessity. Some of those marriages were happy, some were not, and many ended when the trapper decided to return to civilization. "Is that what people think about us?" Teresa asked, "that this is temporary?" "I do not care what people think," Yates pulled her close. "I know this is permanent. You are stuck with me until one of us dies, and even then I will probably haunt you just to make sure you are all right." Teresa laughed and kissed him. "I would expect nothing less." Summer brought more work tending Teresa's expanded garden, hunting and preserving meat, making repairs to the cabin and corral. Yates caught and broke a young mare, intending her as a gift for Teresa so she could ride independently. Teresa named the mare Juniper after the trees that grew around their valley, and spent hours getting to know her new horse. It was in July that Teresa realized she had not had her monthly courses in quite some time. She mentioned it casually to Yates one evening, not thinking much of it, and watched his face transform. "Teresa, do you know what that means?" "I suppose it could mean several things," Teresa said slowly, and then the significance hit her. Oh, do you think I might be pregnant?" Yates looked terrified and delighted in equal measure. "It is possible. More than possible, given how often we—" He stopped, flushing slightly. "We should get you to Helena, have someone who knows about these things check you over." Teresa put her hand on her still flat stomach, feeling a sense of wonder. "I could be carrying our child." "Our child." Yates repeated the words like a prayer, and then he was gathering her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Teresa, if this is true, if we are going to be parents—" "We will figure it out," Teresa said, though she felt just as overwhelmed as he looked. "Just like we have figured out everything else." A week later, the midwife in Helena confirmed what they had suspected. Teresa was indeed pregnant, probably about 3 months along, and by the midwife's estimation, she would deliver sometime in late December or early January. The midwife, a practical woman named Margaret, gave Teresa a long list of instructions and warnings, most of which involved not doing anything too strenuous and making sure she got proper nutrition. Yates took the instructions with the seriousness of a man receiving battle orders. He became almost obsessively protective, refusing to let Teresa lift anything heavy, insisting she rest more, hunting obsessively to make sure they had plenty of meat. Teresa found his concern both touching and occasionally frustrating, especially when he tried to stop her from doing normal chores. "I am pregnant, not dying," she told him after he physically removed an axe from her hands. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can still split kindling." "Not my wife," Yates said stubbornly. "Not while she is carrying my child. You can do other things. Let me do the heavy work." They compromised, with Teresa agreeing to avoid the most strenuous tasks in exchange for Yates stopping his hovering. But secretly, Teresa loved how protective he was, how much he clearly cared about her well-being and the life growing inside her. She had not imagined she would be a mother so soon, but now that it was happening, she found herself excited and terrified in equal measure. As fall approached and Teresa's belly began to swell noticeably, they started preparing for the baby in earnest. Yates built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth so there would be no splinters. Teresa sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her stitches careful and precise. They discussed names endlessly, unable to agree on anything definite but enjoying the process of imagining their future child. It was in October that the buffalo hunters returned. Teresa and Yates were working outside the cabin when they heard horses approaching. Yates immediately positioned himself between Teresa and the trail, his hand going to the rifle he now carried everywhere. 4 men emerged from the tree line, and Teresa recognized them with a jolt of shock and fear. It was the same 4 buffalo hunters from the trading post, the ones who had harassed her, the ones Yates had forced to apologize on their knees. The thick hunter who had been their spokesman sneered when he saw them. "Well, look who it is, the mountain man and his woman. Heard you two got hitched. That is touching." Yates's expression was hard as stone. "State your business or move along." "Our business is that we remember what you did to us," the younger hunter said. "You humiliated us, made us kneel like dogs. That is not something we can just forget." Teresa felt fear clench in her stomach, and she instinctively put a hand on her belly. Yates noticed the gesture, and his expression became, if possible, even more dangerous. "That was months ago. You made crude comments, I corrected your behavior, and that should have been the end of it. If you have come here looking for revenge, you will regret it." 4 against 1, the thick hunter said, "and you do not even have that knife on you this time. You have got a rifle, sure, but you cannot shoot all of us before we get to you. And then what happens to your pretty little wife?" Yates's voice dropped to a deadly quiet. "If you threaten her, if you even think about threatening her, I will kill all of you. I do not care about odds or weapons or anything else. I will end you." The hunters exchanged glances, clearly trying to decide if Yates was bluffing. Teresa knew he was not. She could see the absolute conviction in every line of his body, the readiness to do whatever was necessary to protect her. And suddenly, she was angry. Angry that these men had come to their home, angry that they could not just let go of their wounded pride, angry that they were threatening the life she and Yates had built. "You should leave," Teresa said, her voice steady despite her fear. "You are trespassing and you are not welcome here." The young hunter laughed. "Listen to her giving orders. You have got her well trained, Dalton. Does she kneel for you the way we had to?" Yates moved so fast that Teresa barely saw it. One moment he was standing beside her. The next he had crossed the distance to the hunters and driven his fist into the young man's face with enough force to knock him clean off his horse. The other 3 hunters scrambled for their weapons, but Yates had already grabbed the thick hunter by his shirt and hauled him down as well. "Run inside!" Yates barked at Teresa. "Bar the door! Do not come out until I tell you!" Teresa wanted to argue, wanted to stay and help somehow, but she knew she would only be a distraction. She ran for the cabin, her heart pounding, and slammed the door behind her. She shoved the heavy wooden bar into place and then pressed her ear against the door, trying to hear what was happening outside. There were sounds of fighting thuds and grunts and the meaty impact of fists on flesh. Teresa heard someone cry out in pain, heard horses whinnying in distress. She wanted desperately to look out the window, but was afraid of drawing attention to herself. All she could do was wait and pray and clutch her belly protectively. The fight seemed to go on forever, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then there was silence, broken only by heavy breathing. Teresa waited, her whole body tense, until she heard Yates's voice. "Teresa, you can come out now. It is safe." She unbarred the door with shaking hands and stepped outside. The scene that greeted her was brutal but decisive. All 4 buffalo hunters were on the ground, bloodied and groaning. Yates was standing over them, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding but otherwise apparently unhurt. His pale gray eyes found hers immediately. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine." "Are you hurt?" "Nothing serious." Yates turned his attention back to the hunters. "Here is what is going to happen. You 4 are going to get on your horses and ride out of here. You are going to stay far away from this valley, and you are never going to bother me or my wife again. If I see any of you within 5 miles of this cabin, I will assume you mean harm, and I will respond accordingly. Do you understand?" The thick hunter spat blood. "You broke my nose." "Be grateful that is all I broke. You came here threatening a pregnant woman. You are lucky I'm letting you leave at all." Yates's voice was ice cold. "Now get out of my sight before I change my mind." The hunters struggled to their feet, helping each other climb back onto their horses. They rode away without another word, and Teresa watched them disappear into the forest with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. When they were gone, she turned to Yates. "They might come back." "They will not." Yates flexed his bruised hands, wincing slightly. "Men like that are cowards at heart. They thought they could intimidate us because we are isolated, but now they know better. They know I will protect you no matter what it costs me." Teresa moved to him and carefully took his hands in hers, examining the damage. "You need to let me clean these. You could get an infection. I am more worried about you." "Did the stress hurt the baby?" "The baby is fine. I am fine." Teresa led him back inside the cabin and set about tending to his injuries, washing the blood from his knuckles and wrapping them in clean cloth. As she worked, she found herself thinking about how much her life had changed. A year ago, she would have been horrified by the violence she had just witnessed. Now, she understood that sometimes violence was necessary, that the wilderness required a different kind of morality than civilization did. That night, Yates held her close in their bed, his large body curved protectively around hers. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said quietly. "I know it must have been frightening." "It was," Teresa admitted, "but I also knew you would keep me safe. I've never doubted that, not for a moment. I would die before I let anyone hurt you or our child." Yates placed his hand over her belly, feeling the slight swell. "You two are my whole world now." Teresa covered his hand with her own. "And you are ours." November and December passed in a blur of preparation for winter and the coming baby. Margaret, the midwife, rode out to the cabin twice to check on Teresa, pronouncing both mother and baby healthy and strong. She agreed to come stay with them when Teresa's time drew near, and Yates paid her double her usual fee to ensure she would be available. Teresa's labor began on the 2nd day of January in the year 1875, starting with mild cramps that gradually intensified into waves of pain that took her breath away. Yates sent for Margaret immediately and then paced the cabin like a caged animal, while Teresa endured the contractions with gritted teeth. When Margaret finally arrived, she shooed Yates out of the cabin and set about helping Teresa through the delivery. It was the hardest thing Teresa had ever done, harder even than surviving the wagon train attack, harder than learning to live in the wilderness. The pain was immense and all-consuming, and there were moments when she thought she could not possibly continue. But Margaret was there, coaching her through each contraction, and Teresa could hear Yates outside the cabin door, his presence a comfort, even though he could not be with her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was really about 12 hours, Teresa felt a final wrenching push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby crying. Margaret cleaned the infant quickly and wrapped it in a blanket before placing the bundle in Teresa's arms. "You have a son," she announced with a smile. "A big, healthy boy." Teresa looked down at her son, at his wrinkled red face and tiny fists, and felt love crash over her like a wave. "He is perfect," she whispered. Margaret opened the door and called for Yates, who burst into the cabin looking wild-eyed and terrified. He stopped dead when he saw Teresa holding the baby, his expression transforming into something soft and wondering. "Is that your son?" Teresa said, smiling through her exhaustion. "Come meet him." Yates approached slowly, as if afraid he might break something, and carefully took the baby when Teresa offered him. The sight of this huge, fierce mountain man cradling a tiny infant with such tender care made Teresa's heart swell almost painfully. Yates stared down at his son with an expression of absolute awe. "He is so small." "He's actually quite large for a newborn," Margaret said dryly. 8 pounds at least. You two make big babies." "What should we name him?" Yates asked, not taking his eyes off the infant. Teresa had been thinking about this for months. "I was thinking Samuel, after my father." Yates looked up, his pale eyes shining with emotion. "Samuel Dalton. I like it. Your father would be proud." "I think he would be," Teresa agreed softly. Margaret stayed for 3 days to make sure both Teresa and Samuel were recovering well, and then she rode back to Helena with promises to check on them in a few weeks. Left alone with their new son, Teresa and Yates navigated the strange new world of parenthood with a mixture of confidence and confusion. Samuel was a good baby overall, though he had powerful lungs when he was hungry or uncomfortable. Yates proved to be a surprisingly capable father, changing diapers without complaint and walking the floor with Samuel when he would not settle. The winter that year was particularly harsh, with snow piling up past the cabin windows and temperatures dropping so low that water froze solid within minutes of being drawn from the well. But inside the cabin, the Dalton family was warm and content. Teresa spent hours nursing Samuel and watching him sleep, marveling at how something so small could contain so much of her heart. Yates continued his endless work keeping them fed and warm, but he always made time to sit with his wife and son, the three of them a tight unit against the cold. Spring arrived eventually, as it always did, and with the thaw came more visitors. Trappers and traders spread word that Yates Dalton and his wife had a son, and several people made the journey to the isolated cabin to offer congratulations and bring small gifts. Teresa was touched by the generosity of the mountain community, these rough men who lived hard lives but still found ways to be kind. Ben from the trading post arrived in April with a whole basket of supplies cloth for baby clothes, a wooden rattle he had carved himself, a small bag of peppermints for Teresa. "Thought you could use some extras," he said gruffly. "Raising a baby out here is not easy." "We are managing," Teresa said, showing him Samuel, who was now 4 months old and becoming more alert and interactive every day. "He is a good baby." Ben studied the infant, then looked at Teresa with something like approval in his eyes. "You have done well for yourself, Mrs. Dalton. Not many women could make a life out here, but you have taken to it like you were born to it." After Ben left, Teresa thought about his words. He was right, she had adapted to mountain life in ways she never would have predicted. The girl who had left St. Louis in a fine dress and proper bonnet was gone, replaced by a woman who could tan a hide and shoot a rifle and deliver her own baby with only a midwife for help. She was stronger now, harder in some ways, but also more genuine. She had found a life that suited her, and she would not trade it for anything. The years that followed were full and rich. Samuel grew from an infant into a toddler, then a young boy who was curious about everything and fearless in the way of children who have never known real danger. Teresa watched him grow with a mixture of pride and terror, seeing so much of Yates in his sturdy frame and determined personality. When Samuel was 3, Teresa discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect, and in the spring of 1878, she delivered a daughter they named Margaret after the midwife who had helped bring both their children into the world. The baby had Yates's pale gray eyes and Teresa's dark hair, and she was doted on by both her parents and her older brother. The cabin became more crowded, but also more lively. Samuel and Margaret filled the space with laughter and occasional squabbles, and Teresa found that motherhood suited her even better than she had expected. She loved teaching her children about the world, showing them how to identify plants and animals, reading to them from Yates's collection of books. Yates proved to be a devoted father, patient with his children in ways that surprised Teresa given his normally gruff demeanor. He built Samuel a small bow and taught him to shoot, and he carved elaborate doll houses for Margaret. Though he never raised his voice to them, never used force, but they obeyed him instantly because they respected and loved him. In 1880, when Teresa was 30 and Yates was 39, they made the decision to expand their home. The cabin was too small for their growing family, and Yates designed an addition that would give each child a separate sleeping space. He spent that entire summer working on the construction, with Samuel helping as much as a 6-year-old could. Teresa spent the summer cooking and caring for Margaret and watching their home literally grow around them. By the time the first snow fell that year, the addition was complete and the family had more space than they had ever dreamed of. They celebrated by hosting a gathering inviting the few friends they had made over the years, including Ben from the trading post and Margaret the midwife and several of the more reliable trappers who passed through their area regularly. It was a rare moment of community in their usually isolated existence, and Teresa treasured every moment of it. As the years continued to pass, Teresa sometimes thought about the wagon train attack that had brought her to Montana. She never forgot her father or the others who had died, but the sharp pain of grief had mellowed into something softer, a sadness that was always present, but no longer overwhelming. She told her children about their grandfather, about the man who had dreamed of starting a new life in the West and had died pursuing that dream. She wanted them to know where they came from, even as they built their own future. Yates aged gracefully, his long hair now threaded with silver, his face more lined but still strong and handsome. He was as devoted to Teresa at 15 years of marriage as he had been on their wedding day, still protective, still tender in the ways that mattered. They had built something extraordinary together, a life that was hard but fulfilling, isolated but never lonely, simple but deeply meaningful. In 1885, when Teresa was 35 and Yates was 44, they welcomed a third child, another son they named Nathan. Samuel was 11 and Margaret was 7, and both were excited to have a new baby brother to help care for. The cabin was full of noise and energy and love, and Teresa could not have been happier. One evening, after all 3 children were finally asleep, Teresa and Yates sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Yates had his arm around her shoulders, and Teresa was leaning into his warmth, savoring these quiet moments that were rare now that they had 3 children. "Do you ever regret it?" Yates asked suddenly. "Staying here instead of going back east or settling in town?" Teresa did not even have to think about her answer. "Never. Not for a single moment. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be. Even though it has been hard, even though we have struggled, especially because of that." Teresa turned to look at him. "Easy lives are not fulfilling lives. We have built something real here, something that matters. Our children are growing up strong and capable and loved. What more could I possibly want?" Yates kissed her forehead. "I do not tell you often enough how grateful I am that you walked into that trading post. My life before you was just existence. You made it a life worth living." "You saved me," Teresa said softly. "In every way a person can be saved. You gave me safety and purpose and a family. You gave me love." "We saved each other," Yates corrected. "That is what marriage is supposed to be." They sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear overhead. Teresa thought about the girl she had been, terrified and alone and covered in blood, stumbling into a trading post with no idea what her future held. She thought about the mountain man who had demanded respect on her behalf, who had offered her sanctuary without expecting anything in return, who had become her husband and the father of her children. Life in the wilderness was never easy. There were hard winters and lean times, illness and injury, and the constant threat of danger. But there was also beauty and freedom, and the deep satisfaction of knowing they were living by their own rules. Teresa had found a strength in herself she never knew existed, had discovered that she was capable of far more than society had ever expected of her. As they finally rose to go inside, Yates took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I love you, Teresa Dalton." "I love you too," Teresa replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Inside the cabin, their children slept peacefully, safe and warm. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, bearing witness to the life this family had carved out of the wilderness. And Teresa knew, with absolute certainty, that this was exactly where she belonged, here in this valley, with this man, building a future one day at a time. The years continued their steady march forward. Samuel grew into a young man who was the image of his father, tall and broad-shouldered and strong, with the same quiet competence and protective instincts. Margaret became a bright, curious girl who loved learning and asked endless questions about everything from the stars to the plants to the way animals behaved. Nathan was still young but already showing signs of having his own distinct personality, more outgoing than his siblings, quicker to laugh, fearless in ways that sometimes made Teresa's heart stop. In 1890, when Samuel was 16, a young woman arrived in the area with her family, settlers trying to establish a ranch in the valley below theirs. The girl's name was Elizabeth, and Teresa watched with amusement as her son became tongue-tied and clumsy whenever she was around. It reminded her of the early days of her own relationship with Yates, the giddy nervousness of new attraction. "He has it bad," Yates observed one evening, watching Samuel practice his rifle shooting with unusual intensity. "He is trying to impress her." "I remember someone else who tried very hard to impress a woman," Teresa said with a smile. "Someone who demanded buffalo hunters apologize on their knees." Yates chuckled. "That was different. I was trying to protect you, not court you. And you ended up doing both." They encouraged Samuel's interest in Elizabeth, inviting her family to dinner and facilitating opportunities for the young people to spend time together. By the time Samuel was 18, he and Elizabeth were openly courting, and Teresa could see marriage in their future. It made her feel old but also deeply satisfied. Her son was becoming a man, finding his own path while still respecting the values she and Yates had taught him. Margaret at 15 was showing no interest in courting, much to Teresa's relief. She was focused on her studies. Teresa had taught all the children to read and write and cipher, and Margaret had taken to education with enthusiasm that surpassed her brothers. She talked sometimes about becoming a teacher, maybe in Helena, or even one of the bigger towns farther east. Teresa supported her ambitions while privately hoping she would not go too far away. Nathan at 10 was pure energy and mischief, constantly getting into minor scrapes and adventures that left Teresa simultaneously exasperated and entertained. He was the social one of their children, making friends easily with the few other families in the area, always ready with a joke or a story. Yates said he'd inherited Teresa's warmth and ability to connect with people, which Teresa found both flattering and terrifying given the isolation of their lives. As Teresa approached her 40th birthday and Yates neared 50, they began to think about the future in more concrete terms. They had built a good life, but they were not getting any younger, and they needed to plan for what would happen to the homestead when they were gone. Samuel would likely inherit the cabin and the land, but they wanted to make sure Margaret and Nathan were also provided for. It was in 1892 that Yates had a serious conversation with Samuel about the future. Teresa listened from the kitchen as father and son talked about responsibility and legacy, about what it meant to be a steward of the land rather than just a user of it. Yates spoke about how he had come to the mountains looking for freedom, but had found something more important: purpose and family and belonging. "This place is more than just logs and land," Yates told Samuel. "It is a home your mother and I built together, raised you and your siblings in, made 1,000 memories in. When it becomes yours someday, I want you to understand what you are inheriting." "I understand, Pa," Samuel said quietly, "and I promise I will take care of it. When Elizabeth and I marry, we will raise our children here, teach them the same lessons you taught me." Teresa had to turn away to hide her tears. Her son was planning his future in this place, choosing to continue what she and Yates had started. It was more than she could have hoped for. In the summer of 1893, Samuel and Elizabeth married in a simple ceremony at the cabin. The whole community turned out for the celebration: mountain men and traders, settlers from the valley, the shopkeeper Ben who had witnessed so much of their family's story, Margaret the midwife, now elderly but still sharp-minded. Teresa looked around at all these people who had become part of their lives and felt overwhelming gratitude. During the reception, Ben pulled Teresa aside. "You remember when you first came to my trading post, covered in blood, terrified with those buffalo hunters harassing you?" "I remember," Teresa said softly. "I remember thinking my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Ben shook his head in amazement. "You have built something remarkable here, Teresa. Not everyone could have done what you did, not just surviving, but thriving. You should be proud." "I am," Teresa said. "Every single day I am grateful for how things turned out." She found Yates later, standing at the edge of the clearing and looking out over the mountains. She slipped her hand into his and he squeezed it gently. "Our son is married," he said, sounding slightly dazed. "When did we get old enough to have a married son?" "The same way we got old enough for anything, one day at a time." Teresa leaned her head on his shoulder. "But we're not old yet. We have got plenty of years left." "Good." Yates turned to look at her, his pale gray eyes still as intense as they had been the day they met. "I plan to spend every single one of those years with you." The years continued their relentless progression. Samuel and Elizabeth built a small cabin of their own on the edge of the property, close enough for help but far enough for privacy. They had their first child in 1894, a daughter who made Teresa a grandmother at 44. Holding her granddaughter for the first time, Teresa felt the circle completing itself from the terrified young woman who had stumbled into a trading post to a grandmother, watching her family grow and multiply. Margaret eventually did become a teacher, but she chose to stay in Montana rather than going farther east. She took a position in Helena and visited home regularly, bringing with her news of the outside world and the slow march of progress. She never married, declaring herself content with her independence, and Teresa respected that choice, even while privately hoping she might find someone who made her as happy as Yates had made Teresa. Nathan grew into a handsome young man who worked as a scout and guide for hunting parties, using the skills his father had taught him to navigate the mountains safely. He had adventures that made Teresa's hair stand on end when she heard about them, but he always came home safe, always with a big grin and a story to tell. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Teresa was 50 and Yates was 59. They were grandparents 4 times over now, with Samuel and Elizabeth having added 3 more children to the family. The cabin that had once housed just 2 people was now the center of a small family compound, with multiple generations living and working together. One day in late spring, Teresa and Yates took a long walk together, something they tried to do regularly to escape the chaos of family life. They followed their favorite trail up to a ridge that overlooked the entire valley, the same view Teresa had first seen when Yates brought her to the cabin all those years ago. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Teresa asked. "When you walked into Ben's trading post and saw me being harassed?" "I think about it all the time," Yates admitted. "I think about how close I came to not going into town that day. I'd been planning to wait another week for supplies, but something made me change my mind. Some instinct I cannot explain. If I had waited, you would have been gone and we never would have met." "Fate," Teresa said softly. "It had to be fate. We were meant to find each other." "I do not know about fate," Yates said slowly, "but I know that meeting you was the single best thing that ever happened to me. You took a lonely mountain man and gave him a family, a purpose, a reason to be more than just a man surviving in the wilderness." Teresa took both his hands in hers, looking up at the face she had loved for 26 years. There were lines around his eyes now, and his hair was more silver than brown, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "You saved my life that day, and then you gave me a life worth living. I could not have asked for a better partner, a better father to my children, a better man to share my days with." Yates pulled her close, and they stood together on the ridge looking out over the valley that had become their kingdom. Below them, they could see the cabin complex, smoke rising from multiple chimneys. They could hear the distant sounds of their grandchildren playing, could see the corrals where horses grazed peacefully. This was their legacy, not wealth or status or social standing, but something far more valuable: family, love, belonging. "I would do it all again," Yates said quietly. "Every hard winter, every difficult moment, every challenge we faced, I would do it all again exactly the same way, because it led me to this, to you, to our children, to this life we built together." "So would I," Teresa agreed, "every single moment." They stayed on the ridge until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. And then they walked back down to their cabin, hand in hand, ready to face whatever years remained to them with the same courage and love that had sustained them through everything else. Because that was the truth Teresa had learned in her years as a mountain wife, that love was not just a feeling, but a choice, made new every single day. It was choosing to stand by your partner through good times and bad, through abundance and scarcity, through joy and sorrow. It was building something together brick by brick, memory by memory, until you had created a life that was greater than the sum of its parts. And as Teresa entered her cabin that evening, surrounded by the noise and warmth of her family, she knew that she had chosen well. The terrified girl who had stumbled into a trading post 26 years ago had become a strong woman, a devoted wife, a loving mother and grandmother. She had found her home in the unlikeliest of places, in the arms of a mountain man who had demanded respect on her behalf, and then spent the rest of his life proving he deserved hers in return. Their story was not one that would be written in history books or remembered by the wider world, but it was real and true and beautiful in all the ways that mattered. It was a story of survival and courage, of protection and devotion, of two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. As night fell over the Montana mountains and the Dalton family settled in for another evening together, Teresa looked across the room at Yates and smiled. He smiled back, that rare, soft expression that was reserved only for her, and in that moment, everything else fell away. All the hardships they had endured, all the challenges they had overcome, none of it mattered compared to what they had gained. They had each other, they had their family, they had their home in the wilderness. And that, Teresa knew with absolute certainty, was more than enough. It was everything.